tonight's topic is plantar pressure systems, how we use them, what we do with the data, etc. And obviously, anyone watching, if you've got any questions, anything you've ever wanted to know, just fire away in the comments, and we'll try and get to them. Bruce, ridiculously experienced in this area, so thanks so much for agreeing to come on. And you've obviously we've moved from a Thursday to a Wednesday, so thanks for being so sort of flexible. But we're going to get cracking with the question that came in most, really. I had more than one person send this to me, and it's like, what is the sort of the dummy's guide to the center of pressure? If you had to explain to someone who is completely new to this topic, what is the center of pressure? What does this all mean? How would you sort of field that question?
So I'm going to share the screen here. If you look on the left-hand side in through here, and I'm also going to make this granular. You can see all these little squares through here. These are cells in the center, in the pressure sensor. So all these little cubes here pick up peak pressures when they're there. So center of pressure basically is an average. So as the sensors in a row, as the pressure is moving forward, they'll do an average all across the row, and then the highest area, that's where they're going to plot that center of pressure as the foot continues to roll forward. And that's essentially what's happening. Now you can see here, this is mine center of pressure. It's actually, relatively normal, very much midline, good pressures underneath the big toe joint, because I've been wearing my orthotics for a long time and they're working for me. They're relatively successful. They're not perfect, but that's me more so than the orthotics. So that's how I would describe center of pressure more than anything else, if that helps. It's an average of all the sensors in a row. As you continue to move forward, it's going to do that, and it will plot that line. So sometimes the line will obviously curve laterally. Occasionally the line can curve medially. It doesn't happen very often that it will curve medially, but there are reasons for that. But normally it will curve laterally for structural reasons and functional reasons within the first ray.
Actually, just on the center of pressure, Bruce, just something occurred to me. And if you look at, especially probably that picture in Mert Root's book about how the center of pressure is quite quite medially initially at the heel, and then goes way out laterally, and then comes across and goes out through the fist meti. But when you look at a lot of plantar pressures, they're almost straight.
Yes.
A little bit of, so what's the difference there?
Well, I mean, the difference there is I don't think Root had any plantar pressure to work with. That's how he assumed the best functioning feet would function. And he's not really, it's not right. I mean, that book should be updated because it's an out of date. It's incorrect. And it's not their fault. They were doing the best they could. He made a pretty good assumption. But the thing is, there are lots of reasons for why the center of pressure can lateralize or medialize or stay center, depending on the orthotic, the shoe, and especially primarily the foot. But it can also depend on what's happening proximally at the torso, the hip, how they're functioning. Those things come into play. That's the thing. Those are the things that stymie me the most, focusing primarily on the foot. But normally you don't really go super lateral or super medial at the heel. It's maybe a little bit lateral at the heel, more so than medial, though. You can see on this, again, I'm going to share this screen. You'll see right here that look how high the pressures are here, but look where the center of pressure is. Okay.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, it's showing that this is there as far as that calculation is. I don't know how the program works, but that's how it works. And different sensors have different numbers of cells. So the PDAR sensors tend to have fewer cells than the TechScan sensors. This is TechScan. Some of the newer sensors that are coming out have even fewer sensors still, and they're trying to do center of pressure calculations. And I'm really taking a lot of those with a big grain of salt because you got really, really big sensors that are doing that. So, work with what it works with and just try to understand the calculations if they'll tell you, because obviously they're proprietary.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Look, I'll come back with a follow-up question. I'm just trying to download a picture I want you to comment on, but it's going to take me a few minutes. So let's move on to the next question, and then I'll come back to that.
Sure.
Yeah, it's still on the same topic, actually, and it's just picking up on something you said, Bruce, that classic word that we all love to hate in podiatry circles, which is the word normal. And we talk about the sort of, the normal center of pressure. And when we talk about things like normal foot posture, we get into huge debates and huge controversy and what is normal. Is there the same sort of debate when it comes to these plantar pressure readings and these center of pressure trajectories? Or is it a bit more accepted that there is a norm?
Well, there's two ways to answer that question. I from the thousands of pressure profiles that I've looked at, I would tell you that the normal would be lateral midline to the heel, moving laterally more than center midline through the lateral column through the midfoot, up to about the 5th MPJ, then swinging back over to usually the 2nd or 3rd MPJ with minimal pressures underneath the great toe. And hallux, the center pressures is kind of go out between that 2nd and 3rd MPJ. That would be a combined normal of everything that I've ever seen. Now, what I will tell you, though, is the caveat is this. It all depends on the structure and function of that foot and ankle, okay? So if you've got a truly plantar flexed, very stiff first ray, it's going to change things. It will medialize. The center pressure will move medial very quickly because that first ray does not have much, if any, excursion. So it's very stiff. So it's going to change things. Now, quite often, the 5th ray may be either compliant or very stiff as well in those instances. So there's excursion and compliance issues, stiffness issues at the lateral column and the medial column. Those things matter. So what I can tell you is in those patients who have long 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rays, if you see the x-ray, they've got metatarsalgia or neuroma issues, they may have higher pressures on the lateral column if they have an ankle joint equinus, because they're going to hit they're going to plantar flex very quickly. The heel's going to come off the ground very quickly. Or if they have a limb length difference issue, so they're going to continue to be on that lateral column, and then they're going to move medial, okay? So there's lots of things at play here for everybody to understand and how that works. So it depends. This is why I talk about these things all the time. This is why I talk about, I know I mentioned my Mercury XML, which I've been very coy about, but it's essentially, it's an evaluation process that I use. It's very specific segmentally, and it pairs very, very much so with the pressure mapping.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Now, look, I've managed to download this picture,
okay,
which I'll share. I downloaded this from a lecture I have on my boot camp on the flow motion model. Have you ever seen a center of pressure that looks like that?
No.
No, either have I. Good. Thank you. Ian may know the backstory, but this is that you can see, you're striking the ground, you pronate, the suspension phase. So the load goes medially here, then it goes way over laterally to the base of the 5th met. And I've looked at thousands of plantar pressures. I've never seen anything looking like that, but this is the alleged normal. So I just need you to confirm that I'm not the only one that's never seen it.
Well, if you take out the suspension phase in that picture and then connect a line between the contact and the 3rd one, whatever that was, that would be relatively what I described as normal initially. But what they don't understand, obviously, is they've never really done any pressure mapping, that there's not much meat in the medial column for most people to necessarily put pressure in that area anyway. And if there's instability in that area, you move away from instability. That's how pressure mapping works. Where it's stable, the pressure is there.
Yeah. No, I think this was a bit of wishful thinking of someone wanting the pressure to be that way to fit into their model of the way they describe foot function. But yeah. So anyway, let's move on now.
There's a lot about the human foot that particular individual doesn't understand, but that's probably talk another day.
Yeah.
So we're going to come on to what this information, what we do with this information, or what it means in a second. But one other question that came in, which is probably sensible to ask right now, is what other information do we get from these pressure reading systems? Obviously, we've talked about the center of pressure, but is that the thing you use mostly? Or if not, what sort of stuff are you, when you look at this data, are you really trying to pull from it and finding most useful?
Well, one of the things I'll tweet about quite often when I want to go on my tweet rants is timing matters so much. Howard, obviously, Dannenberg taught me that. He looks at the force time curves a lot. I like to run through the static images, the peaked images frame by frame by frame, and I can compare accelerations. I can show you that real quick if you like. It's just a matter of if you off-peak this, which I'm doing right now, and then you just advance, you can see how that moves forward, and it'll do it again. Okay, you look at it this way. You can compare accelerations from left to right, and it can make a difference. So you can advance this frame by frame by frame easily that way as well. Okay, so that's one of the things I'll look at. I will look at center of pressure. That makes a difference. I will look at force time curves, which are over here, because that can give you some interesting information. I don't think we should talk about that too much because it can be, that takes a lot of time. It can be confusing. I will look at peak pressures depending on what the issue is. If they have a metatarsalgia or neuroma issue, in general, where that area is will show up. Okay, and there are structural and functional reasons for that. So that, and if they're prone to callus or ulceration formation, again, you'll see those high pressures for a prolonged period of time quite often. Craig talks about loading and unloading rates, especially with limb length difference or things like that. And we can get to that when you're ready for that. But mainly I'm looking at timing. I'm looking at the static pressure comparisons, the center of pressure, and what the function is underneath the first MPJ. How quickly does the lateral column load? How quickly do the heels unload compared to what my physical examination was? Do they have a limb length difference? If they do, is it structural? Is it functional? If it's functional, and then when I treat that, either via taping and felt or via an orthotic modification, does it quantitatively change? In other words, did my prescription work? So those are the things I'm looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll talk about your clinical decision-making in a second, but do we have enough confidence in this kind of data to say with confidence, I guess, that if we're screening an asymptomatic population, that it's predictive, consistently predictive of anything? Are we there with this sort of information yet?
As far as I'm concerned, yes. And I understand your question because the majority of the studies obviously are done on asymptomatic individuals, which is wrong at times. I understand why it's done that way, but it's not always beneficial. Regardless, even those who are asymptomatic may have structural and functional issues that researchers are failing to pick up on that would lend to different functioning patterns. So like say a high-end running company or shoe manufacturing company like Nike, and they want to take a look at all their plantar pressures, and they're looking at all their team members, their high functioning team members, where they're the absolute elites or the sub elites. They're fast people. Fast people tend to have more rigid foot structure, more stiffness in there, because that's how they're faster than the rest of us. There are other factors and components that go along with that, but they're not going to have pancake, flat, flexible feet, or they're not going to be able to run as quickly and turn over as quickly as they normally will. So they're looking through a keyhole when they do their little in-house studies, and they're only getting a very limited patient population to understand. So I've had a much broader patient population, so I've seen it on both sides. So I think I have a 17 years worth of better understanding, and Howard's got even more than I do. But yes, the problems with the research are that it's not specific enough, especially with symptoms or problems. The benefit of it is it gives you enough of enough data to say, we did see these things, that you can compare that then to a symptomatic population and say, if we can see it in the asymptomatic population, chances are we're going to see it even more in the symptomatic population. And there are plenty of studies out there, whether they were done directly or indirectly on these things, that touch on pressure mapping, whether it's center of pressure, timing, or other things like that, that you can connect these dots and infer what's going on, which is what we do clinically. I'm not a PhD researcher, so I don't have to take everything away and make no assumptions. I get to make assumptions every single day because I'm a clinician. So yay.
Yeah, just Bruce, Emma Cowley's just made a comment with a question mark after it, and she's just said COP is a proxy for kinematics with a question mark after it, which is an interesting thought.
Well, I mean, everything that's in Norman, and I, Norm from TechScan, and we talked about this, and he said a long time ago that pressure mapping is kinematics. Okay, it's the motion of the foot. It's 2D. Okay, it's not fully 3D, but it's showing the plantar pressure, so you can infer lots of different things and how that works. And bless Norman, sorry for what happened to him. That's a different story and situation, but he was exactly right. All pressure mapping, regardless of whether it's just center of pressure, is kinematics of foot function. When Howard Dannenberg explains the delays in the force time curve and how they are constant force over a prolonged period of time, because that means that something is not moving. There is a joint, there is a segment that is not moving, pivoting, or rotating as it normally should, and something has caused that flat line. That's kinematics, just as much as it is if we picked that up on 3D using Vicon imaging. Okay, so it compares. Now, the benefit of me doing what I've done for 17 years is I can take inertial measurement unit data or Vicon 3D kinematic data, and I can look at those studies, and after puzzling through them, because I don't see them all the time for a slightly longer period of time, I can know that if I did the pressure mapping, I pretty much know what's going on with that foot, one side versus the other. I've got a pretty good idea because the data is all very, very similar. But if you combine them and you've got the pressure mapping with these other kinematic data, you get that much more information, in my opinion.
Yeah, actually, Emma's just followed up and with another question, in the foot or higher, and I suspect the answer to that is higher. But we just, from the plantar pressure, you just can't tell what joint it is. There's, that flat spot that you talk about. You talk about. I talk about it as well.
Yeah, well, she's right. That's why you have to know what's going on. If there's a reason from your exam for you to appreciate the fact that there's going to be a delay in function because of a functional hallux libitus or an ankle joint issue or excessive pronation that may have caused those things, that's one thing. If you're not picking up on those and there's delays, but then you see that flat line anywhere, now you may need to start thinking a little bit higher because there could be other reasons for why that occurs.
And we've just got another comment from Simon Dickinson. You mentioned this briefly earlier about how well can you quantify the load rate? And that's obviously the shape of the curve, that's...
Well, I'm not a mathematician and I don't write the programs that gives this data. I think a lot of it is up. To me, the reason I like TechScan, other than the fact that it's the only unit I've ever had as far as pressure mapping is concerned. I've had a good relationship with them. They also have the highest, it's like a 4K TV is what I tell people. It's ultra high definition versus other ones that have fewer sensors. That doesn't mean that PR is necessarily any less. Many people would argue that it is absolutely not. But again, it comes down to how much can you break down the data? And TechScan has twice as many pressure sensors in their sensors, cells in their sensors than PDAR does, which is going to give you more granularity, which you would think may make their calculations, if their calculations are equal, at a higher level. That's my opinion, and I back that up completely. No. Again, I'm not a clinician, not a mathematician. So.
No. But I think for clinical use, you draw a box on an area and you get a curve in that box, and the load rate is the slope of that curve. We can debate how accurate that is based on number of sensors and the different technologies used. I think from my own work, I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the load rate. I reckon I spend more time looking at the down. What's the rate of the load coming off, especially under the heel? I went through a stage where I thought that was a really important parameter.
Well, they both are. The thing is, what happens, a lot of people, you walk behind people and you see these kids walking in keds and girls and boys, and their heel pops up off the ground. They hang there for a second and then they move forward. Yeah. That's going to convert into kinematics as far as pressure mapping is concerned, because you're going to see a quick unloading rate, then a flat line, not completely flat, but it's going to kind of rounded, and then it's going to drop off depending on how quickly they move forward. Now, there are reasons for all of those, but we probably don't have time. But if you want to get into those, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, maybe just hold it. We never get through everything in these sessions anyway, but maybe we'll hold that one, come back to the end. You got some more questions there, Ian?
Yeah, just following on from our theme, really, which was we talked about sort of the screening of asymptomatic. Let's talk about the symptomatic, the people in front of you, the athletes or whoever they are, with the pathology, the known pathology, which I'm presuming you have an idea of before you get them anywhere near your pressure system because of the history, the physical. How does this extra bit of data, and I'm making an assumption that you do it on everyone, and call me out on that if that's incorrect, but how does this bit of pressure data that you collect significantly influence or add to your clinical decision making? And do you think it's dramatically different to an assessment that you would do without that data?
Well, just like there are forced time curves, there's also learning curves. I know that Howard got to a point towards the end of his career where he was doing fewer of the full pressure analyses that he was doing earlier on. And I know why that is, because he already knew from how the foot functioned pretty much how it was going to do that. The beauty of it is you're always going to be surprised, okay? So occasionally you will see things that will surprise you once you've done this enough. But initially, for the first 5 or 10 years of doing these, it's gonna make a difference. Where it really makes a difference for me was in what am I gonna do from an orthotic prescription basis? How am I gonna tape the foot? Where am I gonna put my padding so that I can mimic an orthotic device? And in doing that, you can see the changes that you can affect on the foot. Now from that, I learned kind of backwards, so to speak. The nice way for me to say it is I learned to reverse engineer. I reverse engineered how an orthotic works into what I did with the taping and padding and the results that I got from pressure mapping. So being able to experiment and do these things and see, no, that didn't make a difference. Yes, that did make a difference. And you can also talk to the patient and see what their things and see how things go. It doesn't always work the way you want them to, okay? Because there are always reasons where you can't sometimes provide enough stability, even through a device, to get them to propulse the way that you want them to, or they have other upper hamstring and glute issues, and they're starting to get older and they can't propulse anyway because of balance issues. So there are always reasons why you can't always get the full outcomes that you want. But does it make a difference? Absolutely. I do it in the higher end more often than I do in the lower end of my patients now, because it can be time consuming. But the thing is, the reason I do that is because they want to see the difference. That's why they're there. I also want to make sure I'm not making any mistakes. Everybody has a day where you're a little bit rushed or a little bit tired, and maybe you're not focusing as much as you did. You go through your exam, and you're like, oh, this is all pretty much symmetrical. And then you go and you do this, and you're like, what the hell is that? What did I miss? You go back and look at things again, and you're like, okay, I didn't do a very good job on that ankle joint assessment that I did. I really need to do the ankle joint lunge instead of doing a cheating ankle joint lunge test on the table, which sometimes I will do. So, you're just doing a more thorough evaluation. It's things like that that will catch. But also when I work with high-level athletes, I can test their shoes. They'll bring in multiple pairs of shoes, and I'll test them, and I'll say, yes, yes, no, or no, no, yes, or absolutely not on any of these. They all stink. Find something else. Those things make a difference, too, in how that will affect them, whether they have their orthotics or whether they do not. Does that help?
Great. Yeah, no, brilliant. I mean, I've certainly spoken to people who are sort of entertaining the idea of getting this software in their practice, but the hurdle for them is possibly not knowing how they're going to reconcile the findings with what they're actually going to do. So they don't like the idea of spending thousands of pounds or dollars to get a bit of kit, to get some data, to put the data in the medical notes, and then they don't do anything with that data. If you were to advise someone completely new to pressure mapping of any kind, and we'll talk about the different kinds in a second, but if you were to advise someone who was new to the game in a private practice that was going to get a system, like, how would you advise they start out? Like you said, the first 5 years at plus or a learning curve. Obviously, you don't want to make that too apparent to the athlete sitting in front of you. But how would you advise they start out? What should they? How should they sort of hit that learning curve without kind of feeling too worried about it being obvious they're on a learning curve?
Well, number one, again, you got to rethink your physical exam and make sure that you're very thorough. I reverse engineered. Things are whatever I can do with an orthotic are the things that are the areas where I want to focus on segmentally. And then the same thing with the pressure mapping. Okay. So if I want to obviously I use first-rate cutouts. A lot of people do not. And Craig's, named appropriately, very nicely, the Bruce test after me and how we did that functional hallux limitus test. Maybe we can do a video on that one since we get so many hits on the ankle joint manipulation one. Maybe we can do a Bruce test video when we're in New York next week. But yeah, that said, that's one of the things, at least for first ray. Then there are other things too, the stiffness values that I assess. So if you've got a good evaluation system and you know how to do that, and you understand how orthotics work, and you understand how taping can work, just doing that and going through your process and watching. You want to watch the timing. You want to watch smoothing of the curves. You want to beg, borrow, or steal anything that Howard Dannenberg has ever written or published. And I think if people are really, really egg me on, I've got some things that I need to scan and upload and put online for people. I have just about every one of the things he's ever written. I've got it in a box under my stairs in my basement, so I need to get that out. They're good things, but it takes you a while to figure them out, because he talks more about force versus time curves than he does about comparing accelerations and other things like that. I found it easier to learn slightly differently, and then I backed my way into what was going on with most of the force versus time curves. But so fake it until you make it. If you're getting it because you want to do a running population, make sure you get a really good walking analysis, and just explain to them, because the walking analysis is going to give you 95% of the data that you need, regardless of whether you get them on a treadmill wearing this stuff. Trust me, okay? Because they're moving much slower. Yes, they move a little bit differently, and they can load a little bit differently, but unless you're really dialed up to a high hertz, a high frames per second, you're not going to get as good a data at looking at the running curves. And also, it's interesting, when people are running for a short period of time, they tend to run much more efficiently than they will walk. It is amazing. Trust me, you will see it. It sounds like Donald Trump, trust me. But anyway.
Yeah, actually, my experience is a little bit different to that, Bruce, in that I've gone through phases where I've used pressure mapping, haven't used it. And I think when I first started using it was when I was issuing orthotics, not part of the diagnostic process. I, for a while, was not seeing the first met head lighting up like I would like. So I changed my casting technique to plantar flex the first ray. And then I stopped using the plantar pressure because it wasn't actually giving me any additional information, except on that really rare occasion. But we have actually just had 2 questions come in from Robert Isaacs. I probably won't mention the second one, but Robert's asked about. Yeah, I assume you've just seen the second question, Bruce.
Yes.
Yeah. But his first question was about Halle Gabrielesi. So let's just share my screen, and obviously he is a mega pronator.
Yes.
And that's going to be the new word now, mega pronator. Now, Robert's asked a question about what do you think his center of pressure is going to be like in plantar, if you were to assess him, and what you could do to change it.
Well, you already had that. Just put up that video, that little screenshot you had earlier of the suspension portion of the S-shaped.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously what it should look like, right?
Yeah.
Not exactly, obviously. That's a good question. I would love to see what that looks like. But again, as I said when we had that earlier, this so-called suspension phase, just for lack of, just that they happen to call it that, he's still not hitting the ground. So it's not necessarily going to increase the pressures in that area. What's going to happen is he's still, in general, going to be more midline to lateral during that heel contact. What I expect to see with him, everybody focus. Can you run that video one more time? Everybody focuses on the pronation. How much of that is caused by ankle joint equinus?
And just give me a moment where
Root talks about that, and then he was correct that ankle joint equinus definitely can increase pronation issues. So is that exactly what's going on? Maybe not 100%, but the guy was still efficient regardless. So, what are you going to do to correct this? That's the question for 1,000 years. Do you necessarily want to mess with brilliance? Maybe his career could have been longer. Who knows? But I think he had a pretty long career anyway, didn't he?
Yeah, he's a fast runner, and this is evidence. This is evidence that overpronation is not a problem. This is evidence that foot orthotics work, and this is evidence we don't know what we're talking about. So, we won't go that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so many factors that could be going on there, but Anyway, I've not looked at his feet.
I've long wondered how much of that is actually just the shoe and not his foot. I've long wondered that about that video. But maybe we're getting off the beaten track.
Yeah.
Rob's just made a comment. I think it's worthy of mentioning. If Howard Dannenberg ever disappears, we need to check under Bruce's cellar.
No. Nope. That's
so. Let's talk about pressure plate versus in shoe. I believe I'm right in saying you're an in shoe man. And again, I'm trying to frame this. Oh, you have both. Okay, great, even better. So I'm trying to frame this again in the context of people watching who may be thinking, or maybe considering dabbling. What are the pros and cons of each? And I mean, is there a reason you have both? Do people need both? Where do you start? How would you sort of field those questions?
Well, I lead more towards in shoe because I've used it more than anything else. But you can, the pressure mats are cheaper. They're easy, I mean, it's normally twice the price to get an in shoe system, roughly, or anywhere, or at least another 25% to 30% more than getting a mat. A lot of the mats that are out now, sorry, tech scan, but your mats are not as high definition as many of the other ones like RS scans, which is absolutely beautiful, and a couple of other ones that are out there that are very, very high definition. They're really, really nice. So the nice thing about the mats is that they're easy to use, easy for people to walk over. And actually you can do quite a bit. If you know how to tape and accommodate your patients, you can test an orthotic prescription utilizing a pressure mat. Okay. Figure out what you want to do. If you want to use heel lifts, if you don't want to use heel lifts, if you want to do any posting, if you want to use a Lodi, if you want to valgus post the lateral column, if you want to add a Cluffy type wedge underneath the great toe, any of those things can be done, and you can test that prescription on a pressure mat, and you should see some changes. Now you can do the same thing with in-shoe pressure. One of the biggest differences between pressure mat and in-shoe pressure is that on the pressure mats, if the feet externally rotate or internally rotate, abductor adductor, you're going to see that. So you're going to see them function this way. And then you can compare how the center of pressure works by how they're actually functioning. Normally, internally rotated, externally rotated. Okay, and that makes a difference. When you're doing in shoe, you can't see that unless you get in video. They may do the same things, but you're not going to pick that up. So you can actually see that transverse plane rotation, which is kind of nice. It is a big advantage to using pressure mats as opposed to using the in shoe. Now, it depends on the patient population that you're working on and whether that's going to make a difference. But they both have their pros and cons. For me, I'd go with the cheaper system to get going and start doing things. You can't obviously put it on a treadmill unless you incorporate it with a treadmill, though I found that those aren't very good in general and are ridiculously expensive. Just have somebody run across the thing if you want them to do that, a couple of strides on each foot. It tends to work just fine. You're going to get the data that you need, but the walking data, again, as I said, is going to be primary. But the nice thing about the in-shoe is now you can test against different shoes. Now you can see whether the shoe makes a difference. There are lots of reasons for the in-shoe for why it's better, as far as evaluating shoes and as far as evaluating orthotics. Because if you have an actual orthotic, unless you're going to really sports tape that thing to the patient's foot and have them attempt to walk like that over the pressure mat, it's just not going to give you the data that you think you're going to get. The nice thing about an in-shoe pressure system is if you sandwich that thing between the patient's foot and the orthotic, now you're going to get real actionable data. Is that orthotic that they got from one of your competitors or from Bruce Williams in the US crap? Or is it something that's working exceptionally well and we need to try and figure out how to reproduce this? Or pick up the phone, say, can you give me the prescription so we can reproduce this? They moved. They don't want to go to you anymore. It's just one of those things, because that makes a difference, okay? But then you can tweak it and make it better, lots of things like that. That's the beauty of the in-shoe if you want to get to that level. You're starting out, the mat is good. You can do the taping and the accommodation. Trust me, I do it every single day. There's that Donald Trump again. And no, the lighting is just terrible in here, Robert Isaacs. That's why I'm dark. Trump has not started messing with our electricity that I'm aware of. So,
while you're on the topic of the in-shoe system on top of the orthosis, the shell of the device, the paper that the paper would be remiss not to talk about is the one from Simon Spooner, David Smith, and Kevin Kirby that was published in JAPMA. couple of years ago, which sort of highlighted what they perceived to be some of the limitations of doing so. The idea that some sensors are sitting on the flat and some sensors are sitting at 45-degree angle, and then questioning obviously the reliability or the validity of this data. What's your sort of take on that that limitation?
You know, I've got to go with the fact that I assume they're probably correct. I mean, those sensors are made to be malleable so that you can get that data. If you don't make it malleable, how are you going to get that data in any other way? Saying that, I will also say that my take has always kind of been, again, these sensors give you two-dimensional data. If you want three-dimensional data, you need to use a force plate. Unfortunately, nobody has made a force plate that will fit into your shoes, and force plates will give you data that is not as user-friendly or clinically friendly as pressure mapping data is. Obviously, it's cheaper and it's easier to work with, but it's two-dimensional, and you have to infer some of the planes. So like with transverse plane rotations, you can infer that with in-shoe. Varus rotations, you can infer that with in-shoe if you know what's going on. The sagittal plane is number one. It's king when it comes to pressure mapping. If you're using a pressure mat, now not only can you see the rotations of the feet at certain times if you're using video, and then kind of syncing it up as best you can with the pressure mat, the center of force, center of pressure, things like that. Now you can also see how those things work, why the foot's doing what it's doing, what it is actually doing at that time as it's externally rotating, internally rotating, or functioning rectus. Those things do make a difference. So watching people walk barefoot on a mat is a good way to learn, especially even with a camera phone to take some video and record on that. You don't have to go real expensive. So that said, the varus rotations, and one of the things I've said for many, many years, and I know Craig can back me up on this, and I said it's 4 degrees. What do we all post? Apparently all post our forefoot, our rear foot, forefoot varus in. 4. Every single time I see somebody else's prescription, 4. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. Did you even do anything with this? I mean, seriously. And a lot of times I don't ever use any forefoot or rear foot varus posting. I'll use valgus posting, but everybody, 4. I'm like, okay. Anyway, that said, how much, that's not 4 degrees. That's not a lot of movement. And as we've shown, again, I'm going to go and share this again. Oh, shoot, I messed it up. Share the screen. When we look at this center of force, as we talked about, look where the high pressures are here. And see high pressure here, center of force, or center of pressure here. It is slightly more medial. Here, it's a little bit broader, but again, it's slightly medial, maybe a little bit more midline. These things make a difference. And now, is this because there's curvature on the device? Did I use a medial heel skive, which I did on my orthotics? Is that why this is higher here? Well, look what it did. It did actually bring in the center of pressure slightly more medial. Is it as obvious as maybe Simon and Kevin would like when studying what they're studying? Probably not. But again, we're talking 3 to 4 degrees, and maybe it's not going to make as big a difference kinematically as we would think, because I think if you look at the actual kinematic studies using Vicon, they can't pick that up. There's no way they can pick that up. They can't get anything that small. What do they study most of the time? They study more sagittal plane motions at joints than they do necessarily. They can do external and internal rotation. That's easy, okay? They can do sagittal plane motions at the MPJs and at the ankle and stuff like that, provided they do the calculations and they gather the data correctly. They can do those just fine. But how, you've got so many studies that say, yeah, we didn't see a difference. Yes, we did see a difference. I mean, it's like, are they doing the data correctly? Is it the kinematics? Is it the feet that they were using? There's so many different things to say, how much of a change can we actually make? And as Craig has said so many times on Podiatry Arena, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. Put that orthotic in the shoe, they're still going to pronate through the device. But my point is, they may pronate into and through that device, but the question now is, did the timing change? Though they may be pronating and creating pressure into that device, did their accelerations increase so that they're no longer flatlining, they're no longer stuck in pronation at that point? Now they were able to transition into that midfoot ankle joint range of motion moving and moving.
But Bruce, that's exactly why the comment I made earlier, it's the slope of that load coming off.
Yes.
That's you watch them visually, the thought made no difference, but the steepness of that curve of the load coming off the heel is much steeper. You've made quite a substantial difference. And my assumption is if that load's coming off the heel quicker and easier and sooner, there's less loads going through the tissues. That's less pathologic. So that's why I thought that was quite a parameter at one stage. Well, I still do.
It is. Yep.
Okay.
Anything that's coming on?
Yeah, there've been a couple, but I think they've been touched on. Steve Wells asked, do you have to use the mat barefoot only? Generally, yes, you do, but you can walk over it with your shoe, but I'm not sure whether that gives you any useful data. Would you do it with a shoe on over a mat, Bruce?
No, it's I've seen it. And here's the big problem. The way the shoes function, if you've got a chunkier shoe, just the lever that it has, and if it's stable, it's going to pronate you faster anyway. Yeah. You know what I mean? If it's a more flexible shoe, now your foot can function the way it normally is going to, whether you've tried to make a change to it or not, but you don't know what the foot's doing inside the shoe. And that's ultimately why I feel that, in shoe is superior. If you can have both, that's the best of both worlds. If you can have an inertial measurement unit or an IMU in combination, now you're essentially got a portable gait analysis lab. But that's another story.
Sure. Yeah.
Bruce, when we do these things with patients, particularly when there's the screenshot you've put up a couple of times, very eye-catching, the colours and the foot shape. There's a sense of theatre to it. I think that we would all agree. And certainly in my experience, and I've played around with this a bit as well. I've certainly picked my athletes that I've not wanted to do this for, because just like our language or any intervention we do has this ability to have this beautiful placebo effect, and some people, just the fact that they're looking at these colours, they know they're getting or they believe they're getting the best care. I've definitely made mistakes in the past myself where I've done it with the wrong type of personality, these type A personalities that we refer to them in London, and suddenly that's it, an hour session, I can't get them out my door. They want to take my laptop with them because they really, it's almost, they attach themselves to it too much, and it almost becomes nocivic, in theory. What's your experience with that? Is it universally sort of a good thing to do, or do you find a bit like me, certain people it's a really bad idea to do with?
I haven't had that experience so much. I will tell you what I have been told by professional athletic trainers a number of times when I've worked with teams is that do your analysis and don't discuss whatever you find with the athlete. In other words, do it and let them go. They're like, let us take care of that later. And I'm like, okay, understood. And some of the athletes are like, so what is it? What are you seeing? Whatever. And I'm like, well, I'm going to put together a report and we're going to give it to you to the trainer. And then they're going to talk to you about this and they'll make some decisions. And some of them don't like that very much. And some of them do. And I'm sure they have their reasonings. And that may be exactly along the lines of what you're talking about. In general, in my practice, I haven't found that as much, but runners, if you're going to treat runners, you have enough runners. Runners are high maintenance. It's that type of population. And, if you're a runner yourself, it certainly makes things a little bit easier in understanding some of the things that they go through. But you're always going to hit those who want to focus on the information too much, just the same as they won't stop running when you've just told them and shown them that they have a stress fracture, and, maybe they need to stop, or maybe you can accommodate that area so that it no longer hurts them, which is a possibility. It's something that you can do depending on where it is and for some of the patients. But in general, if the thing starts to move or it's just not healing, they need to stop. And obviously many of these patients won't. They're just, as you said, they're type A+, and everything is super hyper focused, and that's just the way that they are.
I'm conscious that we've been pretty much unintentionally, I think, talking in the world of sports injury and musculoskeletal, just because that's where the three of us live our lives and where our biases lie. And I saw a question come in, and I can't remember who it was now, about the treatment of diabetics. Do you see? I mean, I know you're primarily running a sports clinic as well, Bruce, but I mean, do you see that kind of population of patients as well?
I do to a much lesser extent now than I used to, but I did plenty of it. The interesting thing about, so I'm going to go on a slight tangent here. I hate the idea that people feel that there are accommodative orthotics and that there are functional orthotics. And the reason I really hate that is because I've done enough pressure mapping to know that it's bullshit. Okay. You can, it just is. Everything that we do has a functional component, except putting a flat piece of Spanko in your shoe, just a top cover. That's not going to make a difference. But if you're going to wedge or lift or do something along those lines, or even accommodate, it may have a functional effect. When I treat my diabetics, I create a functional device that may have areas of accommodation. Okay. People may call it an accommodative device, but I think that's crap. One of the things you have to realize too is that high pressures are not the end way. It's not should not be the primary focus of using pressure mapping. Lots of people have high pressures. People with metatarsalgia, people with neuroma have high pressures. People with functional and or structural hallux limitus will have pressures off the chart underneath their hallux. You know who else has high pressures? People who are diabetic, who have hallux rigidus or limitus functionally or structurally underneath the hallux. But if they have range of motion within that joint, if they get an ulceration right here, if you Cluffy wedge that area carefully, okay, if it will move and you increase their pressures 2 to 5-fold, but decrease the timing event of that pressure, that ulceration will heal. I've done it multiple times. If they don't have the range of motion, please don't do that. You're only going to make it worse. Okay, and that goes to significantly overweight patients where you can't control their pronation, and or their medial column is excessively low, and it's just hell to pay because they're just overloading this whole medial column so much that it doesn't matter what you do, you're never going to unload that area. And I've tried, and it's really, and you literally, for them, you have to put them in more of a polypropylene or some sort of other more, stiffer device, because the softer functionally accommodated devices just won't work for them as well. But, if they've got motion in a joint that you want to work around, if I can make changes on pressure mapping with taping and accommodation, I can do it with Aliplast Plastizote diabetic orthotics. Okay. So don't believe that these are not functional devices, because they absolutely are, if you will put in the prescriptive elements that will make them a functional device. If you're just going to cast them and accommodate, you're going to get what you created. But if you're going to add the other elements that are necessary, as you would with anything else, you're going to get a better outcome. Your patients I think they're going to do better, and they're probably going to heal faster, and they're probably going to be a little bit more active too if they have less foot pain, except in diabetics if they can't feel their feet anyway. So that's another story.
Craig, my questions are all ticked at this end, and I'm looking at the time, and I know this is about the time you get anxious and start looking at your watch. Is there anything else that's come through?
No, I was going to ask Bruce about. I was going to ask Bruce about leg length differences. So let's assume you have a patient there, they have a leg length difference, but you don't know it. What are you going to expect to see on the pressure mapping?
Well, you're normally going to see one heel unload or off weight faster and earlier than the opposite side. Okay. The accelerations will move faster, and the pressures will decrease on that. Let's say the limb length's on the left side. Most of the time it's on that's the short side. So the pressures will off weight or decrease on that heel very quickly. The accelerations will move forward much more quickly on that side to the midfoot area. And then they may catch up. But initially that's what you would see.
Yeah. In other words, the slope of the curve, the load comes off the area. So, so what are you going to do about that? Anything? Or?
Well, I mean, hopefully you're then going to assess them in standing and check their ASIS and PSIS and their pelvic level and decide, yes, this is an issue. No, it isn't. And also check their spinal curvature to make sure that they don't have a scoliosis. Provided you've done that, you also might want to check their ankle joint range of motion, because if they don't appear to have a limb length difference, but they have about anywhere from 3 to 5 degrees difference in the ankle joint lunge and also the normal or the knee extension test for ankle joint range of motion, or even just having them sit and pull their feet back towards them and seeing one side moving farther, dorsiflexing more than the other, that can give you some indications of what's going on, whether it's muscular weakness or actual blockage. Now that you kind of have a better idea, now you need to realize, what am I going to do? The interesting thing is, when it comes to ankle joint range of motion and limb length difference, they look exactly the same, and they kind of get treated exactly the same. If you can't mobilize that ankle joint to move effectively, now you're going to have to actually treat it as if it's a limb length by adding an extra heel lift. Now, sometimes that means you need to add, so let's say, 1/8 of an inch on one side and nothing on the other, or you may need to add 1/4 of an inch on the short side or the ankle range of motion limited side and 1/8 of an inch on the other side, because it may have some restriction as well that's creating pronation issues that can be alleviated. So, again, those are the things. The interesting thing is to treat them exactly the same if you can't mobilize that ankle joint effectively to get more symmetry.
Sure. So how important are the symmetries you see on plantar pressures?
I think they're incredibly important. I know that there are, Kevin and others at times will say symmetry is not that, important or not as important. But you know what? The patient population that I deal with quite often, back pain, hip pain, knee pain, generalized foot pain, my goal is to get them to function as symmetrically as possible. And when I do, they get better faster and they're much happier, and they become orthotic junkies. They don't want to go without their orthotics because they know what it was like beforehand. And if they go for very long without them, they're not happy campers. They have issues. It works. Do you have to get 100% perfect symmetry? No, you got to get it pretty close, or they're going to continue to have issues. And it's just physics. It's biomechanics. We know how this works. And if you can fine tune those areas, it works relatively well and pretty quickly.
Sure. Yeah. I think when it comes to something like plantar fasciitis on one side, not the other, perhaps working on the symmetries is not important. But when you're talking about those postural problems where the symmetries are going to have their effect, that's probably where it's crucial. But my experience is I've never been able to fix these asymmetries. I've been able to move them closer together, but never quite get it where you want it in the end. But whether that's enough for a therapeutic effect.
Well, it depends on the patient. I mean, if it's somebody that's had long-term chronic pain issues, you're never going to get the symmetries to 100%. Now, if it's somebody that has chronic pain issues, or they're starting to have other issues, but they're in relatively good shape and can still function well, that's just they're experiencing high level of pain and you're trying to stop that, those patients you can usually get to symmetry much closer, if not 100%, and they will do very, very well. It depends on the age of the patient, depends on how good a shape they are in. All of these things make a difference. So you have to take that into effect. And you said something else, and I was going to respond to that. Now I can't think of it, so I'll think about it. Sorry.
No, I think we've just come up to time. So you got nothing more there, Ian?
No, all ticked off this end. Yep.
I think if anyone's got any other questions, I see a lot of people have been joining us late as per normal. The video will be there shortly. If they have any questions, I'm sure Bruce can come along and answer them. So thanks, Bruce. I will see you on Sunday in New York.
Yep.
Anyone else who's going to IFAB. For those who've joined us late, the video will be there in 10 minutes. It will be on YouTube later today, our time, and please subscribe to us on YouTube. So thanks, Ian. Thanks so much, Bruce. It's been
cheers, Bruce. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely, guys. I really appreciate you asking. I appreciate it.